The cemetery lay on the edge of town, forgotten by most, its iron gates rusted and its paths overgrown with weeds. Noah hadn't meant to wander there that night, but his restless mind had pulled him away from the noise of the world. The quiet of the place was strange, almost too perfect, as if even the wind hesitated to disturb it. He walked aimlessly among the gravestones, their inscriptions softened by time, until something caught his eye. At first he thought it was a trick of the moonlight, a faint glow rising from the ground near the center of the graveyard. He paused, his breath hanging in the cold night air, and squinted to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The glow was real, soft and pale, like a lantern flickering just beneath the surface. It came from a single grave. Noah's curiosity pulled him closer. The grave was simple, its stone weathered and cracked. The name was almost erased, as if someone had tried to rub it out. He bent down, brushing dirt away with his sleeve, and managed to make out part of the inscription. In memory of Eleanor. Never forgotten. The words felt heavy, though they offered no explanation. There were no flowers on the grave, just an old broken lantern lying nearby, its glass cloudy and fractured. The glow didn't come from the lantern, though. It seemed to rise directly from the ground, faint but steady. Noah crouched, touching the earth cautiously, half expecting to feel heat or some unnatural force. But the ground was cool and still, like any other. He stood and glanced around, hoping for some clue. But the cemetery was empty, bathed in silence. He stayed for a while, watching the glow, his mind filling with questions. Why this grave? Why Eleanor? And why had no one noticed this before? The longer he stood there, the more he felt something. An invisible pull, like the grave wanted him to stay, to understand. But there was nothing to understand. Not yet. The glow began to fade as the night deepened. Noah waited until it disappeared entirely, leaving the grave in darkness once more. He stood for a moment longer, then turned to leave, his thoughts restless. He knew he would be back the next night. He had to see if it would happen again, if the grave would glow once more. As he walked away, the broken lantern glinted faintly under the moonlight as if watching him leave. The next evening, Noah found himself back at the cemetery before he even realized he had decided to go. The day had been a haze of distractions that couldn't hold his focus. His thoughts kept returning to the glow, to the forgotten grave, to the faint name carved into the stone. He had told himself it wasn't worth obsessing over, but his feet carried him there anyway. The graveyard was as silent as it had been the night before. The air was colder, and the moon hung low, casting its silvery light across the stones. Noah walked the familiar path toward the oak tree, his heart quickening as he drew closer. He told himself he wasn't expecting anything, that the glow could have been a one-time thing, a trick of the light or his tired mind playing games. But as he approached, his breath caught. The grave was glowing again. This time the light seemed stronger, more deliberate. It wasn't the harsh light of a fire or a lamp. It was soft and otherworldly, almost soothing in its presence. Noah stood at the edge of the grave, watching the glow pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. It felt alive in a way he couldn't explain. His mind raced with questions. What was causing it? Was it natural? Was it something else? He crouched down, letting his fingers brush the soil again. The ground was still cool, still ordinary. He glanced at the broken lantern lying beside the grave and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was old, its metal frame rusted and brittle. Whatever glass remained was clouded and cracked, making it impossible for it to be the source of the glow. He set it back down, frustration simmering beneath his curiosity. Looking closer at the gravestone, he traced the worn letters with his fingers. The name Eleanor was clearer in the faint light tonight, though the rest of the inscription remained too damaged to read. He noticed something else, a faint groove near the base of the stone, as if a piece had been chipped away. It didn't seem accidental. As the hours crept by, the glow began to fade again, just as it had the night before. Noah stayed until it disappeared completely, until the grave looked like any other in the cemetery. He couldn't leave it at that. He needed answers. There had to be some kind of explanation, something he wasn't seeing. The next morning, Noah headed to the town library. It wasn't a place he visited often, but if the grave had a story, this was where he'd start. He asked the librarian about the cemetery and mentioned the name Eleanor. The woman furrowed her brow and shook her head. "I've worked here for 30 years, she said. "I don't recall any record of an Eleanor being buried in that cemetery." Her answer unsettled him, but he didn't stop there. He spent hours searching through old records and newspapers looking for anything tied to the cemetery or the name Eleanor. But it was as if she didn't exist. There were no burial records, no obituaries, no mention of her at all. Noah leaned back in his chair, staring at the pile of documents he had sifted through. None of it made sense. The cemetery itself had a long history, dating back over a century, but the grave with the glowing light seemed to be an anomaly, a secret no one had noticed or chosen to remember. As he prepared to leave, an old man at a nearby table spoke up. "You're looking for someone, aren't you?" he said, his voice rough with age. "Someone buried where they shouldn't be." Noah hesitated. The man's words were strange, almost accusatory, but his curiosity outweighed his caution. "How do you know that?" The man gave a dry chuckle, leaning forward. "Because I've seen it too, that light. It's not the first time someone's asked about it." Noah's pulse quickened. "What do you know about it?" The man's face grew serious. "Not here," he said, his voice low. "Meet me tonight. Same graveyard. I'll tell you what I know." Noah nodded, a mix of apprehension and anticipation settling over him. As he left the library, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were closer than ever, and that whatever the old man had to say would change everything. Night fell quickly, and with it came a heavy stillness that settled over the town. Noah walked toward the cemetery, the old man's cryptic words replaying in his mind. He didn't know what to expect, but the man's tone had carried weight, a seriousness that made him believe there was more to this story than just a glowing grave. When Noah reached the cemetery gates, the figure of the old man was already waiting, leaning on a cane under the faint glow of a street lamp. His face, lined with years of hard living, was partially shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. Without a word, he motioned for Noah to follow, leading him toward the glowing grave. The light was already there, faint but steady, casting a ghostly glow over the nearby stones. The old man stopped a few feet from the grave and let out a slow breath. "This isn't just a grave, son. It's a marker," he said, his voice low and somber. "A marker for what?" Noah asked, his heart pounding. "For a story that people in this town wanted to forget," the man replied, his gaze fixed on the glowing light. "Her name was Eleanor. She wasn't from here. She worked as a caretaker at the old manor that burned down years ago. She was kind, always putting others before herself, but she knew too much, and that's what got her killed." Noah's chest tightened. "Killed? How? Why?" The old man hesitated, his grip tightening on the cane. The manor wasn't just a home for the wealthy. It was a place where powerful people hid their sins. Eleanor found out about their secrets, what they were doing to the workers, how they were exploiting them, how they were covering it all up. She tried to expose them, but they made sure she couldn't. Noah felt a chill run down his spine. "And the fire?" The man nodded slowly. "They let the fire take care of everything. Burned the evidence, erased the records. Eleanor's name was never mentioned. They buried her here in secret, and no one ever spoke of her again." Noah stared at the grave, the glow now taking on a deeper meaning. It wasn't just light. It was a cry for recognition, a reminder of a life erased. But why the glow? Why now? The man shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe she's tired of being forgotten. Maybe the truth doesn't want to stay buried anymore. All I know is that it's been happening for years and no one's ever done anything about it." Noah knelt by the grave, his hand brushing the stone. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. He looked up at the old man. "Why are you telling me this?" The man's eyes softened. "Because you're the first person I've seen who cares enough to ask. Maybe it's time someone finally listened." The glow seemed to pulse faintly as the words hung in the air, as if agreeing. Noah stood, his mind racing with the weight of what he had learned. Eleanor's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was an injustice that demanded to be uncovered. As the old man walked away, fading into the shadows, Noah stayed behind, staring at the grave. The glow flickered softly, almost like a heartbeat, and for the first time he didn't feel like he was alone. He knew what he had to do. Eleanor's story wasn't just calling to him, it was begging to be told. The next morning, Noah sat at his desk, staring at the few pieces of evidence he had gathered. There wasn't much: a glowing grave, an old man's story, and a name: Eleanor. It wasn't enough to convince anyone, but it was enough to push him forward. He needed proof, something undeniable that would finally give Eleanor the recognition she deserved. His first stop was the town archives. It was a dusty, neglected building filled with stacks of yellowed papers and forgotten records. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up when Noah explained what he was searching for. "The old manor?" the man muttered. "Most of the records from that place were destroyed in the fire. What's left is in the back, but don't expect much." Noah thanked him and made his way to the back of the room, where rows of metal filing cabinets stood like sentinels of forgotten history. Hours passed as he sifted through faded documents and brittle pages. He was beginning to lose hope when he found a file labeled Ravenwood Manor Incident. The folder was thin, but inside it were fragments of a story, permits, old photographs, and a single cryptic note. The photograph caught his attention first. It showed a group of workers standing in front of the manor, their faces worn but proud. In the background, Eleanor stood apart, her kind smile faint but unmistakable. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, and her eyes seemed to hold a quiet strength. The note was short, written in uneven handwriting. Eleanor knew. She tried to warn us. They silenced her. Noah's hands trembled as he reread the words. It was confirmation of the old man's story, a link between Eleanor and the secrets of the manor. But it wasn't enough. He needed more, something that couldn't be dismissed or denied. He returned to the grave that night, driven by a feeling he couldn't explain. The glow was there, as steady as ever, and the sight of it filled him with a strange sense of purpose. He knelt by the stone, brushing his hand over the earth, and noticed something he hadn't before. A faint outline in the dirt, almost like a lid. His pulse quickened as he began digging with his hands, the soil cold and damp beneath his fingers. After several minutes, he uncovered a small wooden box. It was old, its edges worn smooth by time, and the latch was rusted shut. He pried it open carefully, revealing its contents: a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a tarnished brooch, and a folded piece of paper. The letters were written in Eleanor's hand, their ink faded but still legible. Noah's breath caught as he read the first one. It was addressed to no one in particular, a plea for help from a young woman trapped in a dangerous situation. She described the abuses she had witnessed at the manor, the exploitation of workers, and her attempts to expose the truth. The letters grew more frantic with each page, her words carrying the weight of someone who knew her time was running out. The final piece of paper wasn't a letter, it was a map. It showed the layout of the manor's grounds, with a small X marked in one corner. Next to it, Eleanor had scrawled 3 words: "Find the truth." Noah sat back, his heart pounding. The map was a clue, a final message from Eleanor guiding him toward something she had hidden. The glow of the grave seemed to brighten, as if urging him forward. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stop now. Noah couldn't sleep that night. The map sat on his desk, its edges worn and fragile, the faint X marked in the corner burning into his mind. Eleanor had left this for someone to find, someone who could uncover the truth she had died protecting. He felt a weight of responsibility, as though her voice was whispering directly to him through the years. By morning he had made up his mind. He needed to see where the map led. The old manor grounds were a shadow of what they had once been. The ruins of the burned building stood like a skeletal reminder of the tragedy, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to encroach more each year. Noah parked his car on the side of the road and made his way through the overgrown path, clutching the map tightly in his hand. The air was damp and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Following the map, he reached the edge of the ruins. The structure was still recognizable. The grand archway that had once welcomed guests now stood charred and crumbling, leading into the hollowed-out shell of the manor. Noah hesitated before stepping inside, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The map led him toward the back of the building, to what appeared to have once been the servants' quarters. The floor creaked beneath his weight as he walked, and the air grew colder the deeper he went. At the far end of the room, hidden beneath a pile of debris, he found what he was looking for. The map's markings aligned with a small square section of the floorboards that didn't match the rest. It looked newer, as though it had been replaced long after the fire. Noah knelt and began prying the boards loose, his hands trembling with anticipation. Beneath the floor was a hidden compartment. Inside, he found a small metal chest, its surface blackened by soot but otherwise intact. The chest was locked, but the latch had weakened over time, and Noah was able to force it open. Inside were bundles of papers, photographs, and a single leather-bound journal. He pulled them out carefully, his flashlight illuminating the contents. The journal belonged to Eleanor. Her handwriting filled the pages, detailing everything she had witnessed at the manor. She wrote about the workers, their grueling conditions, and the abuses they endured at the hands of the estate's owner, Victor Ravenswood. She described overhearing secret meetings, financial schemes, and plans to cover up illegal activities. One passage stood out, written with shaky but determined penmanship. "If anything happens to me, know that I tried. The truth must be known." Noah flipped through the pages, his heart pounding with each revelation. The documents in the chest corroborated her claims. Financial records, forged documents, and letters implicating Victor and several other prominent figures in the town. It was everything Eleanor had risked her life to gather, evidence that could finally expose the truth. But as Noah sat there, his flashlight casting a faint glow over the journal, he felt a sudden chill. The air seemed to shift around him, and he heard a faint sound, like the soft rustle of fabric or a whisper carried on the wind. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination. Clutching the journal and documents tightly, he made his way out of the ruins. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as though the world itself was holding its breath. By the time he reached his car, his hands were trembling, but not from fear. He had what he needed. Eleanor's story wasn't buried anymore. As he drove back to town, the glowing grave lingered in his mind. It wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a symbol, a beacon for those willing to see it. And now, Noah had the proof to make the world listen. Noah spent the night carefully going through the journal and the documents he had recovered. Each page felt heavier than the last, filled with detailed accounts of corruption, exploitation, and cruelty. Eleanor had written about Victor Ravenswood's grip on the town, how he used his wealth to control not just the manor but also the lives of those who worked for him. She described secret deals, backdoor threats, and the lives destroyed by his greed. The final entries were the most haunting. Her realization that she was being watched, that her attempts to gather evidence hadn't gone unnoticed. Her last words echoed in Noah's mind. "If they silence me, let this speak for me." By morning, Noah knew he couldn't keep this to himself. Eleanor's truth deserved to be heard, but sharing it wasn't as simple as he had hoped. The Ravenswood name still carried weight in the town, its remnants tied to influential families who wouldn't want these secrets unearthed. Noah also couldn't ignore the growing unease he felt, as if someone, or something, was watching his every move. He reached out to a trusted friend, Laura, a journalist who had made a name for herself by exposing corruption in small towns. When he called her, his voice was steady, but his words carried urgency. "I found something," he said, "something big. But I can't do this alone." Later that afternoon, they met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Noah laid the journal and documents on the table, explaining everything he had discovered. Laura listened intently, her face a mix of shock and determination. "This is incredible," she said, flipping through the pages. "If this is real, and it looks like it is, this could change everything." "It's real," Noah replied firmly, "but I need your help to make sure people believe it." Laura nodded. "We'll need to verify as much as we can. Some of these names, they're powerful. If we go public with this, they'll come after us. We need to be ready." As they spoke, Noah noticed a black car parked across the street, its windows tinted. His stomach churned, but he said nothing, not wanting to alarm Laura. They made plans to meet again the next day and agreed to work together to authenticate the evidence and prepare to release the story. That night, Noah returned to the cemetery. The glow was there again, brighter than ever. It bathed the gravestone in soft light, illuminating Eleanor's name with an almost ethereal clarity. Noah knelt by the grave, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm doing this for you," he said. "Your story won't be forgotten." For the first time, the glow seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. Noah felt a strange sense of peace, as though Eleanor herself was thanking him. But it was fleeting, replaced by the weight of what was to come. He knew this was just the beginning, and the fight to expose the truth would come with its own dangers. As he left the cemetery, he felt the cold night air bite at his skin. The shadows seemed longer, deeper, as though the world was holding its breath for what would happen next. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than Noah expected. Laura worked tirelessly to authenticate the evidence, reaching out to contacts in the journalism world and piecing together the story Eleanor had tried to tell decades ago. The weight of the journal and documents was undeniable. They had everything: financial records, personal letters, and even Eleanor's detailed accounts of what she had witnessed. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. The Ravenswood family and their associates had orchestrated the fire to cover up years of abuse and corruption. But the closer they got to publishing the story, the more dangerous it became. Laura received anonymous threats, and Noah noticed the same black car parked near his apartment on more than one occasion. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Despite the growing tension, they pressed on, knowing that the truth couldn't stay buried. On the night before the story was set to go live, Noah returned to the cemetery one last time. The glow from Eleanor's grave was brighter than ever, casting the entire area in a soft, otherworldly light. He knelt by the gravestone, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "Tomorrow the world will know," he said. "Your story won't be silenced anymore." As he stood to leave, he felt a sudden warmth wash over him, as though the light from the grave was reaching out to him. For a brief moment the glow seemed to take shape, forming a faint, ghostly figure. It was Eleanor. She stood there, her face serene but filled with gratitude. Noah's breath caught, and he blinked, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The glow faded, leaving the grave in peaceful darkness for the first time. The next morning, the story broke. It hit the front page of every major news outlet, exposing the truth about the Ravenswood family and the events that led to Eleanor's death. The evidence was irrefutable, and the public's outrage was immediate. Protests erupted in the town, demanding justice for the workers and recognition for Eleanor's sacrifice. Noah watched from his small apartment as the news unfolded. Laura called him, her voice filled with relief. "We did it," she said. "Eleanor's story is out. People are listening." That evening, Noah returned to the cemetery. The grave was dark, its glow gone, but the air around it felt different, lighter, almost peaceful. He knelt by the stone, his hand resting on the earth. "You can rest now," he whispered. "They know the truth." As he stood to leave, a faint breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree. It carried with it the scent of lavender, just for a moment, and then it was gone. Noah smiled, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Eleanor's story had been told, and her legacy would live on. In the months that followed, the town began to change. The Ravenswood name was stripped of its power, and new investigations opened into the lingering remnants of their influence. A plaque was placed in the cemetery, marking Eleanor's grave and honoring her courage and sacrifice. People visited it daily, leaving flowers and notes of gratitude. For Noah, life didn't return to normal. It couldn't, not after what he had been a part of. But as he walked through the town, now filled with whispers of hope and renewal, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Eleanor's light might no longer glow, but it had sparked something far greater, the truth.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.